Hello and welcome back to the Nancy Boys channel. I know it's been about 6 months since I actually did a review here, and yeah, there's been a lot going on. I'm not going to go into it, but it's nice to be back. And to be honest, I don't think I actually missed that much in terms of horror. I think 2024, we've had a bit of a rough start. I didn't go and see Night Swim just because I didn't hear great things. Lisa Frankenstein kind of passed me by, but the last month or so we've started to really see an uptick in quality. So I've seen three are kind of the most recent releases in kind of the last 3 or 4 weeks, and I thought I'd just do a wrap up of all three films today, just to dive back into getting those reviews done. So one of those films will be Late Night with the Devil, and I'll cover that at the end. But the first, Omen and Immaculate, I want to review those almost as a kind of like a pairing. I've never seen this before in horror, but I've never known two films to come out so closely and to be so similar in terms of not even plot, but in terms of how the films actually play out. Some of the structure was almost identical. So we'll jump into it. But yeah, what I will say is all really good films, and that's kind of why I wanted to kind of come back to reviewing, just to get some thoughts down. So yeah, let's dive into it. So let's start with Immaculate. So normally now I'd start with a bit of a synopsis of the film. I think if we boil the film down to, let's just say, an American nun embarks on a new journey where she joins a convent in Italy. However, her warm welcome quickly turns into a living nightmare when she discovers her new home harbours a sinister secret and unspeakable horrors. That synopsis could literally apply to both the first Omen and Immaculate. It's utterly bizarre. And yeah, as I said, watching those films play out, almost structurally, it's exactly the same. You have the nun arriving at the beginning, getting a really lovely warm welcome, meeting a kind of fellow nun who's a little bit of a rebel. There's another nun on site who's clearly something sinister going on, and we see what happens with her. And then there's some sort of thing or denouement involving the Immaculate Conception of the devil of some kind. So it's just a really unfortunate coincidence that these came out at the same time. I thought, as with the first Omen, this is all about the lead actress, and I thought Sydney Sweeney really sold this film. Her performance really whips it along. She's very charming. She's very kind of, she makes a character really someone that you'd be invested and interested in. And I would say it's a bit of a slow burn. It takes quite a long time to really get going. And that sort of first 45 minutes to an hour, it's kind of a little bit cliche. There's some jump scares that are a little bit obvious, but there's a sort of sinister feeling to it. But yeah, Immaculate was a really strong, serviceable religious horror. And I've got to say, I am not someone that really likes religious horror at all. So religious horror and possession movies are kind of my least favourite genre. So I've seen 3 films in the last month in those kind of categories and actually enjoyed them all. So that was a bit of a surprise. But the fact that I enjoyed it is really something. And although this one had a real slow build, there was sort of just enough intrigue in that first 45 minutes to an hour to kind of pique my interest, to kind of keep me posted on what was coming next, and to kind of find out what was happening. And when this film gets going, it really gets going. I mean, that last 20 minutes of this film is intense. You finally feel like we're getting something. That last kind of 2 minutes, including that performance from Sydney Sweeney, is absolutely amazing. And I think without her, this probably would have been a much more generic film. Lots to like about it. I did think it was a slightly drab looking film. It was kind of quite washed out. It's a shame in a way that both the first Omen and Immaculate both had this sort of Dario Argento-ish feel about them. You know, that kind of American in a kind of foreign country, sinister forces, you don't really know what's happening. Sort of very classic Argento. And if there'd just been a slight more pop of colour across this, and we'll talk about the first Omen, that would have just been a bit more interesting, and it probably would have made that kind of opening hour maybe feel a little bit more exciting. So overall, I thought Immaculate was fairly forgettable. I don't know if I'd go back and watch it again, but it was entertaining, and we had a real ride with it. We really enjoyed it. I would say that's a kind of good solid 7 out of 10. Now, going on to the first Omen, again, very similar in terms of setup, in terms of plot. I think the only thing that really differentiates the first Omen is the fact that it is a prequel to the Omen. But actually, they did a really good job of making that backstory really interesting and really good. Now, if we go back to comparisons with Immaculate, very similar. The first sort of half an hour, 45 minutes, again, is quite slow, quite reliant on jump scares. I would have loved to have had a bit more of a 70s aesthetic. I didn't get a real 70s feel from it. And I thought, God, couldn't we use a camera from back then? Or couldn't we just do some color grading or something just to make it feel like a prequel to The Omen, which is 50 years old, rather than a sort of 2020s horror that then kind of segues quite nicely into The Omen. And I thought that was done really well in terms of the plot. You can almost leave it at a certain point and you go straight into The Omen, and that continuity really works. What I will say, there's a really weird post-credit sequence in the first Omen, which I quite liked actually when I first saw it, but in hindsight and on reflection, I thought it was quite unnecessary, and actually it sort of ruined that sort of seamlessness between the prequel and the original movie. It almost feels like a bit of a setup for a sequel, which I get it. Maybe they saw the film and thought, actually, this is quite good. We can kind of make a property out of this. But I just thought it spoiled the ending of it. Apart from that, as with Immaculate, it really, really steps up its game in that sort of last half an hour. The birthing scene that we see is very graphic. We see a lot of things that we didn't expect to see. You wouldn't expect to see out of a Hollywood movie. I've also got to say, I thought Nell Tiger-Free, I don't know her work that well actually, but she's really good. She's very sympathetic as Margaret. She's a character that you really kind of invest in. But there is one particular scene, which I believe is a kind of a homage to the film Possession. Oh my God, that particular scene, which you'll know when you see it, is just phenomenal. And she's a brilliantly physical actress, but also very, very sympathetic. And I guess that's the one thing I did like about the alternate ending and that kind of post-credit sequence was, kind of being able to see where she ends up next. So as with Sydney Sweeney and Immaculate, I thought Nell Tiger-Free really, really sold that role and really kind of kept me invested. The only thing I would say, which I thought was a bit disappointing, is the Omen movies are kind of like a sort of precursor to the Final Destination franchise. So you'd kind of know a character was going to die, but you didn't know when and how it was going to happen. And you ended up with these quite fun set pieces. And those have been kind of the legendary parts of the whole franchise, even with the sequels that weren't as good. I think with this sequel, they could have just done with a few more of those. Like they started the film making you think that's what we were going to get. We were going to get these kind of awesome like murder set pieces, and then that sort of didn't play out in that way. But a couple more like gnarly deaths would have been really awesome. I think in terms of what it did to the franchise, you don't really get good horror prequels very often. And I think when that sort of original score kicks in at a very pivotal moment of the film, it's a real kind of goosebumps moment. And I think it will be interesting now to go back and watch The Omen again and kind of have a bit more in mind about, how we got to where we did. So I thought they did a great job. It was so much better than I expected it to be. And for religious horror that isn't my thing, I thought it was great. So for the first Omen, I'm going to give that a 7.5 out of 10. And then finally, just because we're talking about religious horror and kind of possession movies, I saw Late Night with the Devil 3 weeks ago, and I've been meaning to talk about it since then. I really enjoyed it. I think it was a real ride. So the film is essentially us watching a 1977 live television broadcast that goes horribly wrong, and then things start to ramp up once you get this writer in and her kind of protege, this girl called Lily. I think it's really sinister. There's something about the way it builds up. You kind of know something's coming. That kind of 70s aesthetic is really well done and really well reproduced. And you do feel like you're watching a kind of TV show in the 70s. It has that sense of the look is just right, the kind of the costumes, and that general sense of foreboding is just really good. I think what I found really frustrating, and this is probably going to spoil it territory if you haven't seen it, but the film is set up as this 1977 documentary, or the film is set up that this 1977 chat show is kind of part of a documentary. So we start off that we're watching a documentary about the TV show. There's two weird things it does really, in terms of quite big missteps in my head. One, when we go to commercial break, we get these very stylized shots of the characters in the break talking about what's just been happening and what's coming next. But it's edited. It doesn't look organic. Like, it would have been awesome for me if this had just been black and white, a static camera that's been left running during the commercial break, and we can just see the characters in one camera shot, just about hearing what they're saying and just understanding what's coming next. But they don't. They go backstage. There are clearly cameramen, multiple cameras filming them. They're mic'd, and it's just a way of getting exposition out. And I just thought it was such a shame. It was such a lost opportunity because it just brought me out of that sense that I was watching something real. And it would have been awesome to have gone into kind of low res, black and white, in those kind of middle parts to just bring out the story more. And it was just a cheat. It just didn't work. And then likewise, we're supposed to be watching this as like rough footage and it's supposed to be part of a documentary. The ending just completely drops the ball. I mean, it just goes from found footage to then it's definitely not a documentary, it's found footage, and then we just sort of enter the character's brain as if we're just watching a regular feature film. We go into this kind of weird fantasy sequence, which I thought was a bit muddled anyway, but it is completely not related to the rest of the film and that setup we're supposed to get. That said, I really enjoyed it. It's only because I've reflected on it that I've kind of picking holes, and I don't want to kind of let that cloud my judgment. I would give it an 8 out of 10, and purely because I want people to go and see it. I think it was really interesting. It's really experimental. There's been a huge backlash in the horror community, or just the film community generally, because they use some AI-generated interstitials kind of throughout the film, which, again, once you know they're there, you can see it, and it's kind of obvious. And the interstitials look kind of cool. There was something offish about them that kind of added to the creepiness. But I kind of understand it. It didn't want to stop me going and seeing the film, though. And ultimately, I thought this was a really brave and interesting concept that broadly was executed really well. I just think narratively, it just went way off base. And they just could have rethought that and just repackaged it in a slightly different way. What I think is just worth noting is that I think Late Night with the Devil is sort of trying to do what Ghostwatch did back in 1992 in the UK. And if you haven't seen Ghostwatch, I just thought the setup of that was a lot more organic, because Ghostwatch was set was a live TV show set in that period. It was broadcast live in 1992, and it was done so at 9 o'clock on a Saturday night when you didn't necessarily know, unless you were really on top of things, that it was a fake, fictional documentary. For me, I was 10 at the time. I remember turning over the TV just after 9 o'clock when it started, and you had trusted broadcasters like Michael Parkinson, Sarah Green, Craig Charles presenting this very BBC looking like kind of puff piece. It was on Halloween about a haunted house in West London, and it escalated from there. And it was so well done because at the time you just trusted it. It just looked like the sort of thing you'd get on a Halloween evening. So I would say if you liked Late Night with the Devil, go and see Ghostwatch, because I think that just gave so much more. And although you might view it through today's lens, you've got to look at it through the lens of that going out live on Halloween night 1992, and most people thinking it was real. And that was banned for years. There was unfortunately a suicide attached to Ghostwatch. It was kind of one of those legendary things that we used to talk about at school because you couldn't see it anymore. And it was one thing that we all as kids lived with, we'd all seen, but could never see it again until more recently it's now on DVD. So that's kind of my recommendation off the back of this, is if you did like Late Night with the Devil, but you want that sort of consistency of presentation that I sort of felt was missing, then go see Ghostwatch, because it was really good. So thank you very much. It's lovely to be back. Some really, really solid films there, and I would recommend all three to go and see them. And I think we've got a great year ahead. We've got some really cool stuff coming. So thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next one.